What is the relationship between argument and the production of knowledge? The kinds of questions we ask, the kind of research that we do, what's that relationship? There's a lot of readings that speak to this, but the one I'm going to talk to you about in this short presentation is the chapter from James Crosswhite's book, Rhetoric of Reason, which is a fantastic book. I highly recommend you read it if you're interested in rhetoric, reasonability, argumentation, persuasion. Fantastic book. Every part of it is good. But the chapter, Argument as Inquiry, is a really interesting chapter because of his, well, two reasons. First, his tracing of the relationship of inquiry, that is the process of knowledge seeking, the process of investigation and figuring out what we know and how we know it, and how inquiry gets set up, which he reserves as a spot for rhetoric. And he traces the history of Western thought from Plato all the way into the modern era, to the 20th century, and talks about that relationship of inquiry and rhetoric. Traditionally, I know it's a very long section of the chapter, but traditionally this is thought of as things in opposition. That is, rhetoric is not interested in generating any kind of new knowledge. Rhetoric is interested in presentation. It's a communication form, and it's about the mechanics of good and accurate presentation of truths and information learned elsewhere. So if you study rhetoric, you're studying delivery mechanisms, how to get ideas across to people, and things like that. You're studying traditional speech. The relationship is much more complicated, Crosswhite points out, because he reserves a space for rhetoric as the meta-discourse of inquiry. That is, you've probably been in a class or a situation, a meeting, philosophy class, a group of friends where people say, well, the question we have to address is blah, blah, blah. And then you might say, why is that the question that we need to address right now? That is the role of rhetoric. That meta-discourse about what questions get in and which ones are left out is the role of rhetoric in terms of inquiry. Inquiry is it's a great term, but it really just means investigation. It just means the seeking of knowledge. And most people don't think of rhetoric as having a role in that. But the question I would ask you is, do you learn if you give a persuasive speech? Or do you learn something you didn't know if you engage in argument? I wonder about this quite a bit, because I feel that in our lives we're taught that the role of argument and the role of persuasion is to get people to come to your view, which is synonymous with the right view. I feel that this is often a fallacy of equivocation. That is, that the right view and your preferred view are seen as the same thing. An example of this is easy to generate in your own mind. If you think of something that you really care deeply and passionately about, something you'd have a lot of difficulty seeing an opposite view of as legitimate, well, then you found something where an equivocation could be possible. A lot of times when we're speaking to an audience, we wonder why they're so wrong instead of wondering why they're so different. We don't consider their views on issues as legitimate because we don't consider their position or anything that would lead up to it as legitimate. I feel like this really harms your ability to get a point across in an argument or to persuade a group of people that you're right. The subtle difference between that and what I'm proposing is that their position might not be legitimate, but all of their life experiences and all of the things that they have exposed to themselves, or all the things they've been exposed to, are legitimate. Life experiences are legitimate. They have to be treated that way. That's going to change the kind of the tone and the approach that people take to your speech or to argument in general, when you're trying to argue with them or when you're trying to persuade people. That's going to be a big factor in how audiences receive you and how these things are dealt with. The other issue, sorry about that, I forgot to silence my phone, and of course people are going to message me right now. The other thing that I think is a problem here is that we think of argumentation as trying to find the right answer, the truth, and that we have discovered the truth through our researching, and then we just need to bring all the wrong people over to the right view. If you want to think about argument as a form of inquiry or a form of meta-discourse about inquiry, as Crosswhite sort of proposes, that it's the meta-inquiry discourse, which I think is a great way to think about it. you have to change that result. It's not about getting to the truth or being right. What it's about is finding what is best. So this goes back to the Douglas Enninger essay about argument as method. If your attitude is that the person you're talking to is wrong and just needs to be corrected, they need to be fixed in some way, you are approaching argumentation in its most limited form. That is, as a bat that you meant to hit people on the head with to get them to agree with you to go onto the right way of thinking. If we say it, what is best is what we have our fidelity to in argumentation. If we think about the best answer to a controversial question, then we will serve our interpretation of the best against an opposite interpretation of the best. In a situation like this, we're really working more together than we are at cross purposes. We're looking for what the best possible result is, and we leave things open to discover the new. And this is how argument and debating can reveal things that nobody would have known had they had just researched it. And it's probably the most powerful incarnation or mode of debating and arguing that you can engage in. Because as human beings, we have this weird rhetorical ability where we cannot have predicted the contents of an argument. We could not know the data. We might not know the proposition. We might not know the situation that's being detailed to us in a persuasive argument. We have no basis in the facts. We're not familiar with it at all. But at the same time, we can recognize it as stunningly brilliant and good. That's one of the weirdest things about it. You can recognize an argument as good and not be able to predict it. Logic would say that you only know a good argument because you know it's aligned with facts. But what if you don't know the facts? What if you don't know the information? What if you're being educated by your opponent? Thinking about what's best as a response to something is a really, really, really superior way to think about the role of argument, because then argument becomes a knowledge generator and not just the oversimplistic transmitter of truth discovered elsewhere, and also not the somewhat limited, well, we'll learn more about our own positions, or take a walk in the shoes of the other side kind of cheesy liberal democratic discourse that we hear in like citizenship scholarship. Beyond that would be the recognition that none of us know, and that we're always engaged in a constant kind of meta discourse about what questions are best. And I think that's kind of the value of the Crosswhite reading. So it is a long reading, the Crosswhite chapter, but I think it's a really valuable one just because of the way he paints the history of inquiry and its relationship to rhetoric is just fantastic. And then secondly, the idea that when you ask a question for research purposes, and then someone says, why is that the question that we're dealing with? You're automatically engaged in rhetoric, and that shows how powerful rhetoric is in shaping the agenda of research.